Hello guys, welcome back to Lines of Battle. Today this is a battle in front of us that can give you a very good insight into some of the tactics in the new update, as well as to how to play well against a much higher rated opponent. In this case we have Zephron playing as blue and a lower rated opponent playing as a red, who's actually 400 ELOs below. But despite this massive ELO difference, as you can see, the game has lasted literally 60 rounds. And if you can hold off a player 400 ELO above you for 60 rounds, then you're probably not as bad as you might have thought. But how did red actually pull this off against blue? Now, first of all, we really want to look into their playstyles, and if you want to look at someone's playstyle, one of the key metrics is just to look at their deployment. We can see how blue has a very dynamic deployment with some general liners in the middle and the heavy infantry corps in the back. They also have some defensive cavalry setting, which is important because the enemy has more cavalry than they do, so blue just opted for a defensive / responsive cavalry deployment. And then we have a spread deployment of skirmishers and some alright positioned artillery at the middle of their army. Red is aware that they are not as good as a player, especially when it comes to calculating quick and precise movements, so red is going to want to play with a much more rigid formation, which is a lot more easier to manage, and therefore they can reduce the chance of them making a blunder, which is going to come very handy against such a high rated opponent. And so based on the deployment, we can see the initial movements of this battle. Now do you see how red is rushing their whole infantry corps while blue is saving their stamina for the decisive engagement, and they are only rushing in with their skirmishers to occupy some of these strategic locations on the map where they could hold out really well. And in fact, miraculously, those blue skirmishers do actually reach a town across the river, and now blue has managed to embed themselves in a core part of the battle site. Red is going to have a bit of a headache trying to remove them from there, and actually, red might just try, which is not a great move, because skirmishers are really tough in towns, and in fact all those red units are being bombarded by these cannons, and they take massive casualties from the melee, the cannon bombardment, and also from the potential fire from the skirmishers, although they are mainly in melee right now as I see it. But by the time that red actually withdraws from that first engagement, some of these units are very close to like half organization. This puts basically most of red's right flank in an organization disadvantage, and yet their only luck is that blue is actually way too far away for them to exploit this weakness over here. And one thing I found about this new update is that actually organization seems to be regaining a lot quicker than before, which does make it so that the game is more forgiving casualty wise, especially for cannons as well, because disabling cannons were really important previously, but now they can just rejoin the battle in such a short times of period that you might want to consider how you want to take out cannons generally. But let's leave that for a bit later. For now, red has still a problem to solve, and they actually managed to find a pretty decent solution. They just wore these skirmishers down gradually with ranged damage, and then they are sending in some flanks to really just gain that enfilade advantage when charging up on the enemy. And so now red managed to recapture the town, and they can finally feel themselves at home north of the river. And so what is the play at this point? Now let's just take a look into this formation and just I really just want you to think about what moves could be played on this position. I'm gonna walk you through some of my observations, starting with the obvious ones, for example that these red units are not going to be able to join the battle anytime soon for at least like 2 or 3 more turns. And you know, if I don't have half my army battle ready, then I probably don't want to engage with the other half either. So I would definitely expect red to take up a defensive position. But at the meanwhile, as I'm playing with blue, I could go for 2 strats because at this moment I still don't want to engage in melee combat because first of all I am outnumbered on the infantry, and second of all I am also outnumbered by the cavalry. So if we want to comfort the enemy as blue, then we need to be tactful about it. Now we could go 2 ways. We could either try to use our artillery to weaken this blob of units over here, to just try to like disable 1 or 2 units ahead of the engagement, or we could be a bit more straightforward and instead just continue working on these units in the center. Now, what could we gain from weakening the center instead of just like trying to stack the artillery damage on the right? Now what we are actually looking out for is actually what is behind the center. We see some easy kill skirmishers and more importantly the enemy's artillery corps. So basically the tactic over here is going to be to weaken the infantries defending the artillery corps so that you could try to take them out in a battle of a skirmish, because once again blue is outnumbered by infantry and by cavalry, so they can't really do much domination by themselves unless they really play on a long-term advantage. And to facilitate this advantage, they would need to completely wipe out the enemy artillery corps. And so blue is going to attempt this by just gradually moving in with their main infantry line and going to stage 2 of their engagement. First of all, they relied on artillery to weaken the center, and now they sent on the line infantry to further weaken the center by, casual firing. But also these units have a second purpose on the flanks. They are there to pin the enemy force down, and even though that red now feels comfortable with moving in with their cavalries and blue having taken some pretty bad casualties, now the enemy's rigid formation is going to be even more tied down, because as soon as the center collapses, all of the units on the flanks who could defend the artilleries are going to be busy fighting against the enemy on the flanks. And so as we move in to observe this decisive charge, you see the guards only charge in once these units are really weakened. And fun fact, in this update charge damage seems to have been reworked. Now you really just need to time your charges right even more than previously you had to, because now it's a lot harder to get the timing right in my opinion. Also, blue is attempting to fend off against red's cavalry charge on the right. They have some initial success in delaying them, but eventually red just bypasses them and the way to blue's cannons lie open. Now at the same time, interestingly, the way to red cannons are also open, because this guard charge proved to be very well, and now essentially blue's infantry could just slowly work off the enemy by going from the center, creating some local supercharge of power and just working down the enemy gradually. But so the 1400 being 1400, they do kinda butcher the attack on blue's cannons, and they only managed to disable 2 of them at the end, while blue also is able to disable 2 of them right now, and then the last one in a couple turns as well. So While red could have really wiped out blue's artillery in that decisive charge, which went very well for them, they actually did fail a bit on the execution part, and blue is now back to where they were before, having an artillery advantage. And I mean, it does really seem like that everything is going alright for blue. I mean, actually even they're simply winning kinda, because red has no cohesive frontline right now, but actually so doesn't blue. In fact, while blue does have a very strong presence on the left, the right is left entirely to red. And you know, that is no joke, because these artilleries are still kind of without garrisons. And so in just a couple of turns, maybe like in one turn, we will get to like a very decisive point in the battle right over here, because some of Red's units are now reorganizing on the north. And actually, in this part of the battle, as crazy as it may sound on a first glimpse, Red is actually up by a 1% army strength. They basically lost 1% less casualties, and that's a very narrow edge, which is very easy to overcome in theory, but it does improve their odds, even much considering how they are lasted 21 turns so far. But so essentially, Red could now make a choice between A, just trying to abuse how divided Blue's front is and send the Southern Army up across the river, or just at the shores on the banks right over here, trying to encircle and destroy Blue's northern flank while they are away from their western flank. This is kind of what I would do to some degree. I might send some forces on the artillery as well down here just for good measures. If I can destroy it, at least I could probably make them keep on the move, so they couldn't really contribute with firepower to the battle. But second choice, you just go all in for the artillery, hoping to wipe them out and try to hold out in the center, and just really play on the fact that you had more infantry and more cavalry at the start. So if there's no artillery in the calculation, then you might just be able to win the game. But committing everything on such a distant charge is probably not my personal choice. In fact, you can probably see Red hesitate for a bit, but then they just like commit into the charge, full heads on, and unfortunately to them, they actually got halted by Blue pretty badly. In fact, they disabled one artillery, and then they lost all of their southern flank. And you know, it's not even that great of a sacrifice, because look at this artillery piece that just got disabled by a couple of turns ago. It's already almost back in the battle. So essentially, Red has achieved nothing, because their advantage that they gained on the artillery front will evaporate in a couple of turns. Meanwhile, their army will take many more turns to actually reform into a proper formation, or let alone rejoin the battle, because these guys will get harassed before they can find a safe place where they could regain their organization. And I mean, at this point, Blue is just absolutely crushing Red, leading by 11 points in power. But so how didn't Blue win in like 30 turns? Why is the game twice as long? That is a really interesting question, because I believe that as good as Zaffron may have played, they actually did kinda mess up this part a little bit. Now, essentially, Red is just reforming their line, and Blue is doing a great thing by falling back. They don't want to engage enemy while they are stronger. However, I do not really get why Blue is so keen on staying defensive behind the river. They could have had enough time. In fact, they did actually have enough time to cross the river and reform a line across the river. A position where they would have been closer to these cannons on the left, and thus they could have disabled them more swiftly if the need had arisen to. At the same time, they did actually regain the town on the right, which is a good location because now they could just harass at the right flank of the enemy, and this time they might be able to utilize on that to actually break through over there at the end, but it is still kind of far away from it. Really just moving in, trying to recapture the desired victory point, because as you know, it would give Red a bit of a less organization loss, so that they could regain their units a bit faster than they would without it. But they have this very stupidly weakened flank on the right, even more terribly so. Do you see the weakness and the rigidness in Red's formation right now? But yeah, for one, they are pretty weakened everywhere because they are second actors in the battles, so-called, so they have actually rejoined the battle after being gunned down. However, the actual weak part comes from their essential rigidness. As you see, there is this very weird flank on the top, which isn't really contributing to the defense of this right over here, but also over here we have Red's artillery, and there is just nothing protecting them from a cavalry charge from the left. I mean, there are some infantry in the center, of course, on the left center kinda, but these could get pinned like they got pinned before. This formation doesn't really seem to benefit Red, which is odd despite that they were the ones who picked this in the first place. But anyhow, as you can probably imagine, Blue will absolutely exploit this as much as they can. They try to move in on the flank, but again, charge damage seems to be a lot more stringent in this update. You really need to double think if you could destroy it or not with charge damage, because if you can, then it would turn into a very costly melee battle. And actually, Red got saved by it kinda on the right. On the left, they were also able to kinda repel an advance for now, but that could only be for so long until Blue tries again with a stronger force or with more determination. But over time, Blue is still just gradually grinding off Red. Like, these troops are still really weak. This cavalry corps is kinda awkward. There might be a lot of them, but they are also not that effective because of their massive losses. And then we also have these regrouping armies trying to rejoin the battle, whereas Blue actually has all the units they could want for this engagement, although they are not deploying them properly. Like, some of these units are really just standing over here, and yeah, they are just not really being that so active, while they could use this moment of time more efficiently to their own benefit. But here comes now the great charge on the left, which was coming for a couple of turns at this point. And also, it is still a very important thing to look at how Blue still has some stamina with their troops, while Red is a lot more tired, because if you remember, they were force marching or running with their units in the first couple of turns of the game, and so Blue has actually preserved their stamina for this moment, so that they could have an advantage in the time of need while their enemy is completely exhausted. And just like that, a massive vibes, completely destroying the enemy left flank and leaving the center completely encircled, the artillery exposed, and these awkward cavalry just like standing there and watching as they have no more hope left. I mean, they do kind of try, but at this point you can really see how the battle is kind of going to Blue's favor, although yet, but is able to repel some attackers on the left by concentrating their power a bit more efficiently. And this is an interesting thing about the battle, is that while red did play with rigid formations, but whenever they were forced outside of these heavy bonded rigid formations, they actually made really good micro moves compared to blue. Like, I believe that this battle lasted this long because blue has actually mismanaged their micromanagement whenever it really mattered, and they kept giving a second chance, so called, to red by kinda messing that single stuff up. Although still, if you look at the casualties real quick, blue is still up by 7%, which at this point is quite significant. You could just put two armies in front of each other and then the one with the more men would win without any tactics involved. It would be a really easy and simple victory for blue. And still, red did kinda come back for a very big loss, because they were down a lot more than 7%, so I guess let's watch this battle a bit longer. But I'm telling you, at this point, red really doesn't stand a chance against blue in the battle. Yeah, they still might gonna try to move, and while red still might try to make a move and try to make these aggressive attacks, they just don't really have enough stamina to even reinforce their own troops somewhere else. And essentially this is actually a pretty good example of why you would want to preserve your stamina and not spend this unless you get a direct advantage from doing so. And yeah, I mean, red just lost by the time limit eventually, and blue has walked away with a very hard fought victory. And we can look at how red was making mistakes throughout this battle, but to be fair, they can hold off a player like 400 or actually more close to 500 ELO above them. So while we should point out the points where they could have improved, but it's also a quite alright performance if they can hold off such a formidable opponent.